Hi everyone, my name is Kassanjee. I'm based at the University of Cape Town and also affiliated to SISIMA. This is the second lecture in the Thinking About Data lecture series. To recap the first lecture, here's a quote by Sherlock Holmes. "Data, data, data," he cried impatiently. "I can't make bricks without clay." The first lecture was all about how data is needed to develop and test theories. So one could think of the data as the clay and the knowledge we want to build as the bricks. While data is crucial, it is equally important that we are cautious in how we use and interpret data, and that's the topic of this lecture. The main goal of this lecture is to remind us that we should always have a healthy skepticism when faced with data. The lecture proceeds through a series of examples that try to highlight the following points. We want to recognize that data are better than anecdotes. We should understand that how the data are collected matters. We should be aware of variability and try not to be fooled by it. And we should always consider the possibility of confounding and other forms of bias. I'd like to thank my colleague, Jim Scott, who identified the examples and put together much of the content on these slides. This lecture is also recorded as 3 videos. When you're done with one, please move on to the next. Before diving in, why do we care about data? In the context of infectious disease modeling, we often have questions, and we develop a model to try to provide answers. In the modeling step, data plays a crucial role. We might want the model outputs to be consistent with data. We might rely on data to inform our model. We should always stop and question how the data we're using was generated. So diving into our first example. In 1998, Dr. Andrew Wakefield published an article claiming an association between the MMR vaccine, that's the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and autism. And his findings were published in what's considered a highly credible journal, namely The Lancet. It was only in 2010 that The Lancet retracted this article following years of investigations. The investigations found that the study was fraught with ethical, financial, and methodological impropriety, and there was a deliberate falsification of some of the research published. However, even though the article was retracted, and many subsequent studies failed to reproduce the findings, many people continued, and sometimes still continue, to believe the MMR vaccine causes autism. Why is this the case? Well, stories are powerful. We tend to get vaccines when we are healthy, and it tends to be a memorable occasion. One needs to make an appointment with the doctor and you get a needle stuck into you. If anything happens afterwards, which is quite possible given that vaccines are given early on in life, it's very convenient to attribute that event to the vaccine, especially when claims have been made and probably others are telling similar stories. It's also really important to remember that these claims that aren't founded on sound data have consequences. In 2007, measles had re-established itself in the United Kingdom, and so a national catch-up program was launched. This is because by that stage, there was quite a large proportion of unprotected 10 to 16-year-olds who had missed out on their vaccination in the late 1990s and early 2000s, at which point measles had actually been eliminated in the UK. So in general, data are better than anecdotes. And even when we're looking at findings in published journal articles, we should make sure that it's founded on sound data. Let's move on to how data are collected. This example is about the 1936 USA presidential election when Franklin D. Roosevelt ran against his contender, Alf Landon. The Literary Digest magazine had successfully predicted the winner of every US presidential election for the previous 2 decades, since 1916. In 1936, the Literary Digest poll was run, and questionnaires were mailed to 10 million people, which is about 25% of the voter population, and 2.4 million people responded. The results showed that Landon was going to win the election, and by quite a margin, with 57%. Looking at the actual results, Roosevelt won with 67% of the votes. This was one of the biggest landslides in US history. So the question to pose is, what went wrong? So to encourage you to think about it before we move on, I'm going to pause here for just about 30 seconds to give you a chance to think about it. And as a prompt, let's think about how the data were collected. So if you'd like a little bit more time, please just hit pause on the video. I'm going to keep going. The sampling frame that was used to identify persons to which to send questionnaires was based on telephone books and automobile registries. At that stage in the USA, it was only the very wealthy that had telephones and cars. So this meant that those who received the questionnaire were systematically different from those who did not. In general, they were the more wealthy parts of the voter population. So just a reminder, 10 million people were sent questionnaires, which is about a quarter of your voters, so it's a very large sample. And then of those 10 million, about 2.4 million returned questionnaires. So again, those 2.4 million might be systematically different from the 10 million in some way. In the end, we have a sample of convenience that's not representative of our voter population. What went wrong here is that there was a large amount of bias. So whenever we estimate something, we can think of the observed value as consisting of three components: the truth that we'd like to know, bias, which is your systematic error, and then chance error, or statistical variability, which might come from, say, only observing a sample of the population that's actually of interest. The sample size does not matter if the data collection scheme is flawed. So in this case, we could have gotten responses from all 10 million people, but this wouldn't have helped resolve the problem because our problem was bias. And to improve bias, we would have had to improve our sampling methods. For example, obtain a simple random sample of the voter population. Now this example is based from quite far in the past, although I think it's quite apt to illustrate bias. Let's think about some of the more modern analyses based on big data. So today we collect large amounts of data every day. For example, on credit card swipes and online purchases, on movement through tracking locations on phones, or on people living with HIV as they access their routine HIV care. Once we have that data, we often try to answer a question with it or look for patterns. And as long as the data has not been collected with a specific purpose in mind, there's the potential of creating huge biases if we use it in an inappropriate way. So this is where the first video ends. When you're ready, please move on to the next one. Thank you.